reasonable, virtuous, kind. Values we all strive for as we grow up, and ones we make sure to stick to as adults. But what happens if something tests those values? If danger comes and threatens you and your loved ones, do you remain steadfast and hold on to them? If those very same values get in the way of your safety, what are you prepared to do? These are the pressing questions asked of one Atticus Finch. Hey y'all, welcome back. Listen, I know the world is crumbling right now, and you might be saying to yourself, how inconsiderate of Piley to drop a book review right now. There's a coup going on. And if that is how you feel, I promise this video has more to do with our current moment than I had any idea. So thank you, and please bear with me. To Kill a Mockingbird is a powerhouse of literary and pop cultural fame. But like most art I experienced as a kid, I feel a primal desire to check back in and dig deeper with a fresh perspective. To get to the bottom of what this book's about, I'm going to explore its value as a piece of high school reading lists and what lessons it may have instilled or reinforced in our culture. I'll start with a general review of the book, and then I'll dig into its larger thematic underpinnings, particularly what I find to be the limitations of its message. Without further ado, let's go. Part 1. The Review. To Kill a Mockingbird is a solid book for high school reading. Asterisk, presented under the proper context. It has some nice, teachable, booky elements to it. Oh god, real academic phrase there, Piley. For example, it's a solid case study in narrative voice. Its style is effortless as it blends the words and thoughts of a child with the perspective of a reasonable adult. It's also a solid coming-of-age story, one that seems well suited for young adults to learn through. Like when Jem's frustrated at court proceedings, and Atticus explains law to him, so the students can understand why our legal system is the way it is. Also, and this only struck me on my recent read-through, but the book has a hefty bit of history to teach. It discusses how different regions of Alabama felt about the Civil War and how those regions voted post-Civil War. It discusses the different hardships of the Great Depression on various groups. It talks of the post-Reconstruction struggle of African Americans, all little bits of history that strike me as well placed alongside the Great Depression part of a history class. That being said, it's important to point out the elements of history the book neglects. For example, the leftover animosity of the Civil War would be harsher. At one point, Atticus says they're not fighting the Yankees, we're fighting our neighbors. But that ignores the many civil rights cases of the time that were portrayed as North versus South. The wrongful conviction of Leo Frank is an example, where his defense team was characterized in Georgia's media as Northerners attempting to meddle in the lives of Southerners. Civil War animosity was often tapped into when convenient, so I imagine it would have come up in Tom's case too. Which leads me to another thing the book missed. Racists aren't single-issue racists. Like the ones stirred up into a frenzy because a black guy was talking to a white lady wouldn't all of a sudden be really chill about Jewish folks or Mexicans, you know? I bring this up not just because it's unlikely black people would be the only oppressed group in town, but to also highlight the fact that civil rights was portrayed as an attempted Jewish influence on Southern life, whether it be allegedly funding civil rights causes or in the presence of Jewish politicians and lawyers trying to make change happen. So it's quite likely this would have popped up in Tom's case. Both of these bits of Southern history are largely ignored in the book. Another inaccuracy, the book portrays hate crimes as stochastic. The mob that tries to murder Tom is said to be new, a spur-of-the-moment collection of angry dudes. This ignores the fact that much of Jim Crow's staying power came from well-organized mobs. In all likelihood, there would be an organized structure already in place, and the attempted attack on Tom wouldn't have been their first public display. Ignoring this gives a little too much sympathy to the racists in town, almost setting up a defense for them, like that they were just really mad this one time, and that's why they're mad at Tom. So, you know, not a fan of that implication. While the book effectively explains the prevailing forces of the region, I want to talk about a reductive element at play in the town's makeup. The Cunninghams are talked up like the noble poor, those who just work really hard and don't ask for much. while the Yules are talked up as these dirty, lazy, mean welfare queens. And there's zero nuance to it. Bob Ewell isn't just kinda lazy. He's described as so unreasonably lazy that he's the only person to ever be kicked out of the WPA for laziness. Which not only deserves an eye roll for how cliche it is to portray not asking for help as some morally superior approach, but is actively harmful to the discourse around poverty. First off, it cannot be overstated how shitty it is to directly link moral worth with how productive somebody is in an economy. Like, fuck you, dude. By assigning a moral binary to how one exists while poor, it aids in casting poverty as a sign of personal or moral failings, a line that's been used to screw over poor people since, I guess, even before the 30s. Really could have done without this reductive shit, but hey, can't really expect much else from Hate Poor People, the country. Next, from a dramatic perspective, the courtroom bits have palpable tension. The way Atticus approaches questioning witnesses, the flow of dialogue, and the way power shifts throughout the conversations, it's all masterful. So much so that most adaptations rip the dialogue word for word. Feels like a clear sign she was onto something. Next, I regret to report that To Kill a Mockingbird both sides is prejudice. Jem claims black people are rude to mixed race or white folks, and the book's framing presents that as equal to the racism white people express, which is misleading since only one group had the institutional power to weaponize their prejudice. If we take the premise, black people were mean to white and mixed race folks, as true, black people at worst ostracized them from social groups, whereas white people had access to institutions that allowed them to inflict violence. One black lady may have been rude to Scout and Jem in church, but she couldn't use the court system to inflict harm on anyone. That's only accessible to white folks, no matter how much folks may dislike the particular white person in Bob Ewell's case. This isn't to say we should never discuss the animosity of that dynamic, but the conversation has to be had in a way that makes clear whose prejudices carry more weight. And To Kill a Mockingbird kinda drops the ball on that. Lastly, the book doesn't give much agency to its black characters. This isn't me critiquing the book from a 2020 lens. I'm not canceling Harper Lee for not being woke enough or whatever. This is a structural problem about the characters lacking dimensions that has been an issue since its first pressing. First, we have Cal, who despite having a fierce word for Scout and Jem when they're acting up, suddenly has nothing to say when political topics come up. That's not to say this part is inaccurate. I'm sure plenty of black women bit their tongues when it came to politics, but in the narrative sense, it's weak. Cal's super close to the family, especially Atticus, so it strikes me that she'd talk openly when politics arose. And the absence of her speaking up rips agency from her. But the most obvious case of lacking agency is Tom. He hardly talks, which limits his ability to express agency. He's described as a respectable that word by various folks in the book. And the implication of him saying, "I felt sorry for Mayella" in court is that he's so weak-minded that he fell into the trap of the lawyer's questions, not that he chose to say it of his own convictions. For a book about the unjust acts committed against black people, it sure doesn't let actual black people have much say in their lives. Now, I want to make this clear before I continue. The criticisms I've levied aren't, in my opinion, reasons to not teach the book. Like I said, it touches on a lot of important topics, which makes it a solid conversation starter for classrooms. And as a cultural touchstone, its flaws shouldn't cause it to be cast aside. The critiques I've presented are to say I think the book is best contextualized with these asterisks around it. There's no harm in acknowledging that the book isn't perfect and for looking at ways to improve the conversations it sought to start. It can be true that To Kill a Mockingbird both presents a genuine decency that was revolutionary for its time, challenging its readers to be empathetic, while also recognizing that it could have been better in a lot of places. So that's my overarching review-y part of the video. But I feel there's an important conversation to still be had, separate from the good or bad recommendation form of a review. And if you would be so inclined, I'd like to share my thoughts on that conversation now. Oh, hold up. My PowerPoint clicker's being a fuck. Shit, too far. Whew, okay, there we go. Part 2. Mockingbird's overall messages. Though there's a lot in the book, a few ideas stand out as the overall messages. First, the book advocates for a measured neutrality. Atticus's first words we hear are to tell Scout and Jem they're both right about an argument. The idea is established from the jump. The main way this message is conveyed is when Atticus suggests his kids walk in other people's shoes to get an understanding of where they're coming from. From Atticus trying to get Scout to understand why the Cunninghams might not be comfortable borrowing money, to him explaining why Bob Ewell harasses folks from the trial, the approach is repeated as a way to get his kids, and the readers, to understand both sides of any given situation. Another value the book advocates for is pacifism. At every point of conflict over Tom's case, Atticus turns the other cheek and tells his kids to do the same. When Bob Ewell threatens and spits on him, Atticus takes pride in walking away without throwing a punch. When Scout assaults her racist cousin, Atticus compels her to walk away next time. Pacifism is not only encouraged, but is hyped up as one of the most courageous things a person can do. These two messages in tandem advocate for a kinda neutral approach, one that highlights the importance of hearing everybody out. And these values are all well and good. It's cool to have a considerate approach to life. That's how I've arrived at my current political outlook. And I could feel how these ideas feel important to teach kids. But there are limits to the values the book tries to instill in its readers. And these aren't limitations I'm pulling out of my ass. These are limitations the book brings up, but never really addresses. Time and time again, Atticus's reasoned approach to make them citizens backfires. First, he says there's no way a clan-like mob would form to hurt Tom. Yet one does, and tries to attack Tom a week later. He trusts the innate goodness of Maycomb residents, yet they, on flawed evidence, convict an innocent man. He assumes Bob's done harassing folks, yet Bob proceeds to nearly kill his kids. At almost every juncture, Atticus is proven wrong. Yet the book goes on to act like his approach is the correct way to go. And it baffled me for a minute until I realized the bespoke take. To Kill a Mockingbird presents a case for why a politics of neutrality fails at combating racism. Part 3. The Limitations of Enlightened Centrism. The first way the book upends its own message is with the walking in someone else's shoes motif. Atticus keeps telling his kids seeing where a person's coming from is important. And as I said, I think that's a solid value to teach kids. But getting a sense of where someone's coming from is only half of it. What's more important is what you do with that information. Atticus is keen on sympathizing with the material struggles of racists, and it's true that economic woes can be used by people in power to stir up racism, but does that mean you gotta treat racism as valid? Atticus thinks so. He at one point says the mob is entitled to full respect for their opinions. And let's be clear, folks, he's not arguing about legality. He says racists are entitled to full respect. Specifically a call for how the wider culture should interact with these men. He insists that the men on the jury are in fact good, reasonable men who just fell victim to getting stirred up a little bit. However, what if being racist is a sign that you're specifically unreasonable? But Atticus, with his neutral approach, can't imagine condemning their hateful ideas like that. In his eyes, he has to give it the credence he would any other idea. And a critique the book makes against itself is this neutral stance creates the perfect environment for racism to brew. Racism is a hateful and incoherent ideology. It needs constant reaffirmation to stick, and said affirmation needs to reach folks through mainstream channels that treat it with legitimacy. So racism, if for no other reason than distribution, requires a culture that treats it as legit if it's ever to obtain and wield power. And Atticus proves more than willing to treat racists with legitimacy. Through the book, we see that racism being respectfully tolerated by even its harshest critics in Maycomb allows racism to fester in the worst kind of way. And, to use a real-world example, the far-right made gains in the 2010s, partially as a result of programs having them on to just hear them out, which aided in legitimizing their violent beliefs. An example of how Atticus's "everyone is entitled to full respect for their opinions" talk creates a space that lets racism flourish. To be clear, when I go against Atticus's entitled to their opinions line, I don't mean we should abridge a racist's freedom of speech. I would never want to set that kind of precedent for a government to run with. I mean that folks and us as a culture have to approach racism as an illegitimate and flawed ideology if it's ever to be defeated. Next, Atticus's pacifist-like conflict avoidance leads him to lump anti-racist discussions in with anti-racist violence. At one point, Scout punches a cousin who is being a racist little piss boy. When Atticus confronts her, he says the noble thing to do is walk away. Say what you will about punching Nazis, but confronting the cousin about his racism isn't unnoble, right? Like Atticus could have said, here's why defending Tom Robinson is good, actually, and next time explain to your awful cousin why he's awful. But he didn't. He instead insists walking away is the only moral option. By omitting the possibility of discussion, Atticus keeps Scout away from a useful tool of anti-racism. Part of building anti-racist movements is confronting people one-on-one and discussing why they might be misguided. If Atticus and his like-minded peers had actively argued for anti-racism out on the town for however many years prior, Tom would have had a better shot, as the dominant culture his peers would have been selected from would have been more sympathetic. It's possible the guys on the jury would have been open to Tom's side of the case if they'd been exposed to anti-racist ideas, but because it was never discussed in polite society, they didn't have a chance to be de-radicalized. Again, we can have the punching Nazis conversation, but at the bare minimum we need to talk about racism, and Atticus's conflict-avoidant pacifism holds us back from that. And worst of all, Atticus is unwilling to examine the flaws in his approach. At the end of the book, the sheriff criticizes him for letting Bob's hatred fester for so long, saying, "There's some men you just have to shoot before you say howdy to them." Yet Atticus, despite compelling evidence in Tate's favor, ends the book by returning to his idea that most people are nice when you finally see them. Atticus is so far down his own rabbit hole, he can't see the problems right in front of his fucking face. Like, let's be real clear about who Atticus is up against. White supremacists. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Everything in the court, everything to do with the mob. These are not reasonable, good faith actors. They're a violent movement, one that Atticus is fundamentally incapable of recognizing, let alone doing anything about. Having his well-meaning, neutral stance proven wrong time and time again, the rise in his own town of overt white supremacy, and even the near-death experiences of his kids aren't enough to shake Atticus of his approach. Which brings me to my final, overarching critique of the book's messages. Atticus's approach to life leaves the reader feeling apathetic, that we're meant to wait on the world to change and not do anything about it. Which feels like it should be the opposite of the message of the book, right? After all, defending Tom in court is active, but in every scenario outside of court, Atticus advocates for walking away and remaining inactive. The clearest example of this tendency, and a detail that really shifted my view of the book, is the fact that Atticus is on the state legislature for Alabama, meaning he's in a position to change things, yet he in one scene bemoans how impossible capital punishment reform is, saying he doubts it'll happen in Jem's lifetime, let alone his. Bro, you're on the legislature. You can try to make the change you want to see. But Atticus, based off the evidence, seems disinterested in trying, which is ultimately unhelpful, seeing as good things don't happen without the radical actions of mass movements. Sitting at home waiting for someone else on the state legislature to change things, or waiting for the culture around you to just magically transform, gets us nowhere. Action is a fundamental component to social progress that Atticus, and To Kill a Mockingbird generally, are unwilling to advocate for. They instead instill passivity in the face of oppression, which inevitably allows oppression to live on. And to tie everything back to the moment we're in, the Trump supporters storming the Capitol, label them a part of whichever movement you'd like, are not in a place to accept reason. They've been presented reason, their claims about the election easily and immediately debunked, yet it doesn't sway them. If we take the Atticus Finch approach to dealing with these folks, if we assume that all we have to do to make it better is ask them to be nice, or wait for them to get their anger out of their system, or wait for the culture to just kind of shift around us magically, we'll be right back to square one in no time. We need to confront and address these problems head on, or we'll never get anywhere. But doing something about the problems facing the world is antithetical to the messages laid out in To Kill a Mockingbird. Part 4. Conclusion. The big takeaway from my recent read-through of To Kill a Mockingbird is it feels incomplete. It overlooks aspects of its own political climate, has some weak characters, and its own calls for passivity and measured reason end up failing the very causes it claims to be fighting for. As a starting block for wider classroom conversations, it seems fine, but the book struggles as a holistic piece of anti-racist literature, as it proves itself unwilling to advocate for the tough, radical action that's necessary. To fulfill its true potential as an ageless titan of civil rights activism, it needs a little more. Luckily for us, a version of the story exists to fulfill that promise, one that presents a comprehensive anti-racist message. That version is Aaron Sorkin's recent Broadway adaptation. Now, and I hate to give y'all blue balls like this, I won't be discussing the adaptation in this video. To give the adaptation the time to unpack I think it deserves, I'll drop a follow-up video next week to dig into what I see as its strengths over the original. So, if you happen to enjoy this video and want to see my follow-up, make sure to smash that motherfucking like button and subscribe down below, you motherfucker. Make sure to ring that little bell and set the notifications to all so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Special shout out to all my lovely patrons, like those whose names are currently on screen. Through their generous support, I'm able to keep this content train a-rolling. So if you like what you see, be sure to join me on Patreon. We are super close to our first goal, where I'll be able to start working on a PragerU debunking series. So be extra sure to join my Patreon if you want to see me dunk on
urine and feces.
Also, if you liked the video, be sure to give it a share on whatever social media you kids are using these days. We are super close to getting partnered, so every new homie you can bring into the community helps out a lot. Thanks much, and I'll see you next time.